Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. I'm your host, Genevieve.
And I'm Carly. And
My light
tonight,
went out.
your light went
And this
out.
is Caroline Rossner. She's
Hi.
our resident veterinarian who's been on here for the past two shows, and she's coming in for part three to talk about joint care, first aid kits, competition prep, and so much more. So,
Yes.
guys, this is going to be a great show for you. I'm going to go correct my light. You guys can get started. We'll be right back.
All right. Excellent. So I guess following up from last week of things that are needing to be done kind of before show season starts up, I ran out of time because I didn't stop talking ever. So this week I've got joint care. So, first and foremost, I know we kind of addressed this previously, is weight loss. If they're overweight, that is terrible for your joints. It's terrible for your horse's joints. Correcting obesity is going to be one of the best things you can do for joint longevity long term, just because they've actually done some research that shows for every extra pound of pressure that they carry weight wise is 3 extra pounds of pressure on their joints. So it's not even just that if you're carrying an extra 100 pounds, it's an extra 100 to the joints. It's actually an extra 300. So it does make a big difference.
Wow.
And so, we kind of addressed it last time too with conditioning, but warming up your horse and cooling it off appropriately is also going to be very helpful for joint care as well. We talked about last time that it takes about 15-20 minutes for those joint capsules and those tendons to really loosen up before you start exercising hard. So, a long, slow warm up is going to be very beneficial as far as trying to minimize extra wear and tear on their joints. And so carrying on along those lines, really the next step is going to be, if you already have wear and tear to your joints, what are the next steps and what are our options that are available? And so first and foremost, we have injectable joint supplements essentially. And so these are going to be ones that are going into the horse in general rather than into the joint itself. And so the main ones that we have are going to be Adequan first and foremost. It's probably the most common one that everybody knows about. Typically with that, you're looking at doing, for the loading dose, an injection every 4 days for a total of 7 doses. And so there's kind of two different schools of thought on Adequan. One is to do the loading dose, that 7 treatment series every 6 months or 12 months or however often it seems like you need it. The other is to do that loading dose and then to give a single dose once a month. Based on speaking with the company, they recommend just repeating the loading dose as needed, but certainly there are people that have good experiences with giving that other dose monthly. And so to answer Joy's question, you don't actually have to keep doing them. Sometimes it may just be that you can do your single series and then that lasts you over for a good amount of time, depending on your level of activity. So it could last for 6 months, it could last for 12, it could last for 24. So it really just depends. So a lot of that is going to be when you start to notice that either your horse is having issues warming up, maybe they're a little stiff coming out of their stall, maybe they're having a little harder time getting up in the field, maybe they're slowing down a little, they're less excited to work. That is going to be one of the most common ones. It's given intramuscularly, and so that's going to be your polysulfated glycosaminoglycan. So what it does is it actually helps to reduce inflammation in the joints. It stimulates the horse's own production of hyaluronic acid as well. And it also will help to, sorry, my allergies are killing me today. So it also does help to increase the horse's synovial fluid production, which lubricates the joints better, but it helps to reduce some of those proteins that are in the joints that can cause inflammation. So overall, that does tend to be helpful, and it tends to work in multiple different joints. So if you've got several different areas that are going to be a little stiff or a little problematic, that can work across the board in kind of multiple areas. Anyone have any questions on Adequan?
Oh, Joy says, I have a joint question. I have a 23-year-old mare who is creaky and stiff. I have her on MSM because an equine nutritionist said that's all that works. What else can I do? I don't really want to do injections.
So in like injections, is in intramuscular injections or is in joint injections? Because those are kind of two separate things. And as far as oral joint supplements go, there's not really a lot of research that shows that they are productive. The most common ingredients that you're going to see are going to be chondroitin sulfate and glucosamine. They did a meta-analysis of multiple glucosamine studies in, I want to say it was 2022, that found that there was really no benefit over a placebo when it came to using glucosamine, and that it has fairly poor oral absorption. Most of the studies that showed good benefit were in vitro, or so in a lab setting in a petri dish. And when it actually came to real life, we didn't see nearly as many results. And so they're thinking the results that people are seeing is more from the omega-3 aspect of those supplements, because omega-3s do actually help to reduce inflammation in the body. And so a lot of sources of glucosamine are going to be from things like shellfish and stuff like that. So those do tend to be high in omega-3s. And I've got later on talking about oral joint supplementation, but UC2 and green-lipped mussel, as well as chondroitin sulfates, are the ones that actually have the most study data behind them, showing that they actually do something versus a placebo.
I think it makes sense with what you said then, that glucosamine or MSN, kind of like what this reminds me of what Sailor was echoing last
Right.
time, that if it works for you and you see that it works for your horse, like continue it, because there might be some hidden factor that is driving its success.
Right, but it's not necessarily the ingredients that people are thinking are doing the most improvement that may actually be giving you
That's
the
fair,
improvement
yeah.
that you're seeing.
Yeah.
So, I've got a whole section on kind of oral joint supplementation later on, but really there's not a whole lot of study data to back up most of the ingredients, or
So
most of those ingredients in the joint supplement.
Kim said, so Adequan would be better for an arthritic or ring bone type joint issue, correct? We've seen a difference with Hyaluronic pellets, but each equine has their own needs.
Yeah, so you certainly could see some improvement with those type of arthritic processes. Ring bone itself tends to be one that can cause fairly significant issues, and it's more of a low motion joint, so you may not see as much improvement for it. Adequan is labeled for carpus, which is the knee and hock joints, but you can definitely see improvement in all of the joints because of the nature of the beast. But ring bone in particular can be a really tricky one to deal with, because it's one of those low motion joints rather than a high motion joint, and so you don't have quite as much synovial fluid or joint fluid, and it tends to not be as forgiving. So that is one where we do tend to see more lameness from those type of arthritic changes than if you were in more of a high motion joint, say something like a
And so
fetlock
is
or a
it still
hock.
considered arthritis for a low motion joint? Just learning here. When I think of arthritis, I always think
Yeah,
of like
so
wrists and
absolutely.
like knees and, things that do
Mhm.
move a lot.
Yeah, so those joints are still joints. You've still got your cartilage, you've still got your joint capsule, you've got your synovial fluid production, but just the volume of that joint is going to be significantly lower. And those low motion joints oftentimes are more prone to arthritis, just because they don't have a lot of that increased movement to be a little bit more forgiving. If you can only move this far, the more concussion that you get, the more damage you can get. When you've got a little bit more movement, that joint can be a little bit more forgiving. So
That
that's a
makes
lot of
sense.
times why the lower hock joints tends to be the ones that we see more arthritis in than the upper joint, which has the most motion.
Interesting.
Yeah, I
And
didn't know
so,
that.
kind of continuing on with the injectable intra-horse joint injectables would be a newer one on the market called Zycosan. It's the first FDA-approved Pentasan in the US, and most of you have probably actually heard of Pentasan. We just didn't have an FDA-approved product before. It was out in Australia for quite a long time, and then this is the version that's now gotten approval in the US. And so it's going to be a series of 4 injections given once a week. unlike Adequan, in their studies, they actually looked at all of the joints. So it's not labeled for one specific joint. And so, it's not super well understood how pentosan works in the body, but the thinking is that it produces a heparin-like substance, and it helps to inhibit some of those proteolytic enzymes that actually will break down the joint and break down cartilage over time. With that, you do want to be a little bit careful using it with other things that can inhibit clotting. So that's not something I'd want to use in a horse that had a big, huge cut or was trying to heal or had a known clotting deficiency. And so that one tends to be one that you do your initial series and then you would finish it up. It's not one where you would continue to give it each month.
Good question. What's the cost like on pentosan
pretty
versus
similar.
Adequan? Really?
For the full course of treatment, so with the Adequan being 7 doses and the pentosan being 4, I mean, they're within a few bucks of each other.
Really?
So, pretty similar as far as cost-wise, and I would say they both tend to work fairly well. I know they do have some rebates going on the Zycosan right now, which is the pentosan. So through the manufacturer, I've got a friend. Through the manufacturer, they've got a $40 rebate coupon that you can get as well. So that does save you a little bit of money now, but that's not usually something that goes on forever. And so, I would say they're fairly well interchangeable. I see good results from both. And then the other one that's one of the more common injectables would be Legend. And so Legend can be used either intravenously or intra-articularly, so it can be given in the joint itself. Obviously, that's not something that most people are going to be comfortable doing at home, and some people are not comfortable giving intravenous injections at home either. But it's going to work in a very similar way by reducing inflammation in the joint, helping to kind of decrease some of that proteolytic activity, but it's actually a hyaluronic acid based injectable. So it's sodium hyaluronate. And so you can use that in combination with the other two. And so there are some that would use, say, Adequan and Legend together if they know they're going into a harder show season and that they've got some arthritic changes, because they work in similar ways, but they have different mechanisms of action. Mm-hmm. And so those are kind of, sorry, this cat is rubbing on the computer. This is why it's shaking. He's very helpful. But, those are kind of the main ones that we see as far as injectable joint supplement options for horses. So do you guys have any questions on that so far?
I do.
Do you see? Yeah, go ahead.
So why would you ever advise a person against injecting versus?
Yeah, so there can be lots of reasons. First and foremost is if they have a reaction to that medication specifically. Okay. Any given creature can have an allergic reaction to really any given substance that's either ingested, injected, or given in some other way, shape, or form. So there's always the risk of having an allergic reaction. Obviously, animals with clotting disorders or immune mediated anemias, things like that, we wouldn't want to use something like Zycosan that has a heparin-like activity, because it could cause other issues. And then some horses just really do not like injections, and it's not safe to give them injections for both the owner and the horse, because obviously if the horse is jumping all around, you risk damaging the neck with a needle. You can break off a needle inside a neck or something like that if they're jumping around. So obviously there's a safety aspect. And then the other thing would be, if you don't see any significant response to it, I wouldn't keep using a product that I don't see any improvement with.
Yeah. What about age? Is age a factor? Like for maybe a yearling, would you advise against that and to go a different route?
I wouldn't use it unless we're actually starting to see issues with arthritis and things of that nature. So if we're starting to see they're flexing more positive, if we see any lamenesses, and you guys know what flexions are, right? Where you hold the joint in a flex position and then have them trot away. Mm-hmm. Then number of lame steps they take is a measure of how much chain we've got in those joints. Young horses are expected to trot away pretty well, and then as they get older and get more wear and tear, you can see much more significant changes. And so, these are things that are designed to be used for osteoarthritis, whichever joint. These are not to be just kind of don't have anywhere.
Caroline, like many of us, I can speak sometimes in the tri-state area, is dealing with intense storms right now. So if she comes and goes, that's why.
I hope I'm still here. Hopefully.
You are
maybe.
sort of present.
All right, excellent.
But it froze on a smile, and that's all that matters.
Oh, that's good. Could have been something like that. That was terrible.
Right. Well, now you did it, Caroline.
So. Oh goodness. But yeah, these are things where you do want to actually use them for their intended purpose rather than not. And then just kind of on a sideline, I know we talked about it a little bit for navicular syndrome, but OSPHOS, it's a bisphosphonate. It helps to stop bone breakdown. It has also been found to help with lower hock arthritis because it helps to alleviate some of that bone pain. But that's not really what I would use it for, but it is oftentimes used in combination with other things if you do have a fairly detrimental arthritis. So, not
Where
one of the ones where
the myth came from then. I assume it's a myth that if you start, because I've always heard this eventing too, like the second you start injections, you're gonna have to continue it for the rest of their life.
That's what I was told too.
Yeah, where did that come from? What's the concept maybe that drove that?
So I think it comes from the fact that if you're having to start treating for arthritis, you're not going to be getting rid of the arthritis that's there. So if you're planning on still continuing to compete at the same level, you are going to have to continue on. But there's nothing to say that you have to continue treating forever. We can definitely see more traumatic type injuries where, it may just be we inject a joint to reduce inflammation that's acute from an injury, and they may never need anything more longer term. But usually, if you've got arthritis or degenerative joint disease, those are going to be processes that once you start having those changes are going to continue long term. But there's nothing to say that you couldn't give Adequan one season and then just not give it again. There's no obligation that you have to continue on with it. But usually there's a reason that you're planning on using it. And typically that arthritis is not going to go away. We're just trying to slow down the disease process. So I think that's kind of where that thought comes from, is we're trying to minimize the inflammation and the discomfort in the joint, but we're also trying to slow down that process as well, so you have longer use before you either have to think about stepping down levels or retiring.
No, that makes sense for sure.
So, and then kind of carrying on from there, I've got my next set as actual joint injections themselves. And so you've got kind of three major categories of substances for joint injections. The most common one in older use would be corticosteroids. And everyone has their own different type of steroid that they prefer to use in joints. They all have their different uses. But the main goal of corticosteroids is to reduce the pain and reduce the inflammation. The downside to those is that repeated use long term can actually have some detrimental effects on the cartilage. So anytime that you're having to use steroids long term, whether they're oral, whether they're injectable, whether they're intra-articular, there's always a risk because over time it slows down healing.
That's what I've heard for people in knees too, is that you've got to be careful not to give or go through too many courses of steroidal shots. I'm only talking here because you went quiet for a second.
But yeah, it was
1 second, Caroline.
Can't hear you,
I'm
Caroline.
gonna bring you back. We're all going through this right now. It is like a monsoon out here too.
Literally, we have been. It's just been like a torrential downpour for the past
5 days now.
I know, it's so depressing.
Yes.
Oh, you're back. We can hear
I
you
have
now.
an extra stream or two in my field that were not there previously. So
I'll never forget years back actually kayaking in our backyard. So
nice. But yeah, you know, with steroids, before there were other things to use, that was kind of the only option that we had, and so you did tend to try to use those judiciously. But certainly they do have a really good anti-inflammatory effect, and so a lot of times they are still a great option as far as trying to quiet that joint. And oftentimes we use them in combination with other things, depending on the size of the joint as well. So that kind of puts me on to the next category, which is lubricants. And so the most common one is going to be hyaluronic acid as far as the lubricant. So that's what the joint naturally produces. And so as joints get worn out, they produce less of that lubricating substance. And so oftentimes by adding that back in, that can help reduce some of the inflammation that way when the joint's not effectively producing enough of its own. It's really only going to be used well in those larger joints. In a little teeny tiny joint, so like the pastern joint or the lower hock joints where there's minimal room, it's really difficult to actually get enough of a lubricant in there. But the bigger joints like the stifle, the upper hock joints, the carpus, the fetlock, those can be really helpful. And so most of them are going to be hyaluronic acid based, but we've also got things like Nultrex or Athramid, which are newer lubricants, as well as there's one called Spring, which is sort of a proprietary cushioning injectable. So it helps to both lubricate and provide some cushion to the joint. It's not really a lubricant, but it kind of doesn't fit into any other category of things. But also you can see some side effects if that actually leaks out of the joint because it's a little bit thicker of a substance. But the Nultrex and Athramid also do help to reduce inflammation while lubricating those joints better. And then the kind of final broad category of joint injections is going to be your biologics. And so those are a lot more of what we're moving towards, especially for younger horses that are starting to have just a little bit of wear and tear. Because those are going to be much safer to use in the joint. And especially if you're using them longer term, you're not going to see the type of degenerative effects that you would with something like a steroid over time. And so those are going to be your things like PRP, ACS, IRAP. They were using stem cells for a bit and they found they weren't maybe doing as much as some of the other things. So now we're not really using those as much.
Sounds expensive.
But they definitely are a little bit more than a steroid injection. But that being said, they're still pretty well priced, all things considering. And a lot of them you do have the option of doing them stall side. So with special processing kits and centrifuges, a lot of times you can take the blood. So you're actually, from all of these, you're actually taking the horse's blood and processing it and then using for PRP, it's what's called platelet-rich plasma. So we're using the highly concentrated platelets that are spun down out of the plasma, so anticoagulated blood, processing those and then injecting them back into a joint. And so those will have an anti-inflammatory effect in the joint most of the time. Platelets can have a pro-inflammatory effect. So if you're already in a really inflamed joint, a lot of times we may look at using a steroid first and then following up a little while later with the PRP instead. So that way you're less likely to have a joint flare.
Shoni
Melissa.
had stem cell PRP with her torn ligament and it healed without any major damage, even though she was well into her 20s. I thought it was great.
That's
crazy.
So stem cells do tend to do a lot better in soft tissue than in joints. So they definitely still have their place there. Just as far as osteoarthritis, they are not really the best. But absolutely for like ligaments, tendons, soft tissue stuff, stem cells are wonderful. And then, ACS is basically a very similar concept. It's autologous conditioned serum. So you're using a anticoagulated sample, so it's going to be an acellular sample, so you're not going to have those you're not going to have full cells in there, but it's a very similar concept in that it helps to reduce inflammation in the joint, helps to stop some of that breakdown activity, which can help therefore re-stimulate that cartilage turnover and cartilage production. And then you've got things like IRAP. That one tends to not be stall side because you actually have to take the blood and incubate it for a little bit, but you can get a larger volume of it. And so with the IRAP, usually you're looking at repeating the treatment every couple weeks for kind of 3 to 5 doses, depending. And so a lot of times you can get at least 3 or 4 doses out of that initial blood sample, but it's one of those things where you do actually have to incubate it, so you can't inject it same day. So there's pros and cons. The IRAP is a little more pricey, but you get several injections worth out of it. With things like PRP, depending on how much of a sample you get, a lot of times you can usually do 2 joints. So it does tend to last fairly well. So you tend to get enough out of it that you can be a little bit more productive. And then there's things like ProStride, which is kind of a combination of PRP with a little bit of IRAP mixed in. So you're not actually taking it to incubate, but you do get some of those properties as well, which would be kind of part of the IRAP process. So those do tend to run a little bit more, but they are still fairly reasonable priced. I want to say ProStride is around maybe $500 or $600, so not super terrible.
And if it saves your horse, yeah.
Right. And, especially if you've got a younger horse that is a competitive horse that is starting to get some wear and tear, if your horse is starting to get wear and tear at 10, 11 years old, if you start doing steroids in those joints, you're actually going to cause those joints to wear out quicker if you're having to do repeated steroid injections. So all in all, you're preserving your horse for longer if we can try to move more towards some of the biologics rather than steroids. But there are definitely times where if a joint is really, really inflamed, we may put steroids in it the first time because you tend to see a huge reduction in inflammation and in pain, and then kind of follow up with some of the biologics.
Now define like broadly as a category biologics versus steroids, because not everybody knows.
Yeah. So biologics are just products that are coming from the horse itself. So they're going to be derived from the blood. So basically someone would pull a blood sample from the horse, process it either stall side or have to take it back and incubate it and then inject that back into the joint. So you're basically using their horse's own tissues in a way to benefit them. So without going too much into immunology and 8 million abbreviations, the body produces things called cytokines, which are chemical signals, and those can either be pro-inflammatory, so create inflammation, or anti-inflammatory. And so with the biologics, you're basically kind of manipulating the horse's body with the processing to have a more anti-inflammatory effect with the products that you're then injecting into the joint.
That's really cool. Yeah.
Right? Because that didn't used to be around.
Did we answer this already? Kimberly says, what reasons have you seen owners do a joint injection versus, say, Adequan or Legends? I'm assuming she means versus like oral. Have they done one to see if it might help prior to jump on IM or more acute injuries?
Yeah, so a lot of times people will use both of those things together. So something like Adequan in addition to joint injections. So you can do those all together. There's no reason why you couldn't. I find joint injections are going to give you a quicker result. So if your horse, say we've got a quarter horse, it's got a left front lameness, and then we determine that it's got navicular syndrome. If we inject the coffin joint, which I prefer over the navicular bursa, just because with the navicular bursa, you're actually having to inject through the deep digital. And so there's a little bit higher risk, whereas with the coffin joint, it will diffuse into the navicular bursa. But typically you're going to see from something like a steroid joint injection, you're going to see within 7 to 10 days the results. And with something like Adequan, it's going to take you longer to see those results. So it's going to take a couple weeks.
Okay.
And so a lot of times if you're looking to be diagnostic as well as therapeutic or to treat them, a lot of times you may go for joint injections, or if you've only got one area that's more of a problem. So you've got, say one bad fetlock, you might just inject that one and not necessarily have to do
the other.
We lost
No,
her.
affected,
There we
then
go.
oh, sad.
You're back.
Sorry, guys.
I can hear you now.
It rained, so the internet's out. But yeah, if you've got multiple joints that are affected, then a lot of times you could just use something like Adequan or Legend. But I do find that the more severe the arthritis is, a lot of times you do end up needing to turn more towards intra-articular therapy. So something injected into the joint, but you certainly can use those things together too. So a lot of times you'll do joint injections and something like Adequan if you are really needing to keep that horse going. So
Cool.
excellent.
That's
I
crazy.
think
Yeah,
that
that's
was
more than I've ever gotten because I've always just avoided it. So
Yeah. Same.
I don't really
Right.
have any practical experience with it. But
yeah. So
we have
both
Joy
of
really quick. She just said,
mine
so
got
if I have an older pony who is sore and stiff after the first day of a competition, is it okay to give her a Gramabute that night? I mean, I take ibuprofen.
absolutely. Honestly, I would probably give it before the competition.
Okay.
Because your anti-inflammatories are going to work a little better if they're on board before you start creating inflammation. So I would even give it the night before or the morning of, depending on how tolerant they are. Ben said if they get a little upset stomach, I'd probably try to do it the night before. But I would try to, if you know to be sore, give it the night before. That way it's on board by the time you actually start riding and start peating and start adding those
I
concussive
guess a
forces to the
question
joints.
about like how long does it stay in the system effectively, and how long does it
About
take
24
to ramp
hours.
up?
Yeah. So about 24
Because I think
hours.
of ibuprofen too,
You
and
can
I'm
give a
like,
half dose
ibuprofen I
every
think is
12.
only 6 hours, and then
Mhm.
I would take it
Right.
after riding.
Right.
Yeah. So I pregame with ibuprofen before I ride because I know I'm gonna
So does
hurt.
Joy.
So
Joy said the same thing. She said, I do that
yeah.
myself. Before I do something
Yes.
I know is going to make me sore. You guys are
I
brilliant.
just already know that I'm going to be miserable after riding, so I just go ahead and start the day with ibuprofen. So, but I do find that it's going to be more effective if you give it beforehand. And typically, if you're giving the full dose of it, it's going to be once a day. If you're giving a half a dose, usually it'll be twice because you don't get as much duration of action.
Okay.
So that would just be something to kind of think about is, depending on when you think you'll need it, usually morning of. Gosh, this cat. Sorry.
An
He is
artistic
roly
shot.
polying and trying to kick my computer.
Joy
So,
says so give her a gram Friday night and Saturday night.
That's what I would think about doing, would be that way you know that it's on board and that it's going to be hitting that therapeutic effect. Because sometimes if you give it in the morning and you're 0:25 and you're riding at 8 a.m., it hasn't actually had a chance to kick in yet.
That's fair.
So,
yeah, it's totally fair.
and then kind of moving on to my final category of joint stuff, which we sort of addressed a little bit earlier, is oral joint supplements. And this is where everything's a little bit kind of messy in that we have a lot of data in other species, but oftentimes not very much in horses. And a lot of times oral bioavailability or absorption is going to be pretty negligible. I want to say it was only about 15% of absorption on things like glucosamine.
Wow.
And while it has tons of data showing that it's effective in a petri dish or in vitro, there's not really that much data showing that it's very effective at all when given orally. And that meta-analysis actually found that most of the effects that people were seeing were from the omega-3 properties, which actually do have much more documented anti-inflammatory properties in the body. So a lot of it is going to be where those supplements are being sourced from. So shells are really common where we're getting glucosamine from, and that tends to be high in omega-3s. The ones that have the most data behind them as far as oral joint supplements are going to be UC2, which is collagen type. And so that's kind of one of the newer ones. Fish oil. If they'll eat it, it doesn't hurt. I go with vegetable oil because it seems to be a little bit more palatable. But I know that those oils are going to be a little higher in omega-3s. You just have to be a little careful because they are also higher calorie, that you're not kind of overfeeding. So a lot of times you have to maybe cut back a little bit if you're adding in oil. But a lot of times they don't necessarily love the taste of fish oil. So if you can sneak it in there, it definitely doesn't hurt. But they can be a little bit more selective than something like dogs or cats when you're trying to feed them things that taste like fish. So
unless you're Hero.
True. Hero did eat chicken
Right?
nuggets, I think.
Oh yeah, Summer has zero qualms about eating things that are meat. So she will eat just about anything, and
She's
she
taking
is
a fish
determined to
out of
like
the
it whether
lake,
she
like.
eats it or not. Oh my gosh, she ate bees the other day. She ate dead carpenter bees that I had thrown out of her water bucket. She just was eating them, and I was like, "Oh my God, no!" And she just kept doing it. And I was like, "All right, well, your problem now." So she's fine.
His goldfish
Actually,
out of
I
the water
do have
too.
goldfish, but they're smart enough to dive down when the horse is.
They're like getting out of here when I see Summer.
Oh my gosh. Yes. I don't know. She strongly believes I'm starving her to death, and it's the worst.
She's like, you're bringing out my carnivorous ways.
Right? So yeah, UC2 actually does have a fair amount of study data on it, more so on kind of the human side of things, but there actually was some studies done in horses, which ideally we'd like to see more of them done, but at around 480 milligrams, they did find that that one was actually fairly therapeutic. Chondroitin sulfate given orally also does have some information behind it showing that it did improve flexion scores and reduce some of the pain from osteoarthritis. And then the other one that has a good amount of study data behind it is green-lipped mussel, and that's MUSSEL, like the aquatic mussel. And so specifically, it has to be the one from New Zealand. So the Camelina perniculus is the specific green-lipped mussel one that helps. And so that one actually has also got some study data showing that it did help to improve flexion scores, increase the number of steps that are being taken. Apparently, yes.
They have
So
it listed for dogs here. I'm Googling it. 'cause I'm like, I've
Three-lipped
never
Right?
mussels.
Green-lipped. Green,
Oh.
like the color. Yes. Oh my
Green-lipped?
gosh. Yes.
Yeah,
Like
that's
actual
why I
lips?
googled it. I
Green-lipped.
was like, what
Like I
is
got that
this?
part right?
Yeah.
Not three-lipped.
Not three, but green.
The three-lipped mussels.
Joy wants
So-
to know if MSM is not good.
So there's nothing saying that it's bad, but there's also nothing really showing that it's beneficial or that it's well absorbed. So it doesn't hurt to give it, but it also, there's just nothing showing that it's going to be super beneficial. There's just really limited data on it. The other thing that they did find is that sometimes having manganese with it helps to absorb some.
Manganese. Did you say mangoes?
Manganese. I think it's a supplement.
Well, so like that. So it's
Uh-oh,
actually
we
very
lost you,
good
Caroline.
as an ingredient.
Manganese.
Manganese is a
Google it.
trace mineral that is essential for our bodies in small amounts. Sorry, I thought you said mangoes.
Oh, I really those two. Not sure what help their joints or not. And then, we do have some other ingredients that I think you're frozen. Am I frozen?
You're working your way back to
yay.
reality.
Okay.
But I can hear you.
Oh, okay, good. And then some of the other ingredients that we tend to see commonly in joint supplements would be things like MSM, ASU, which is avocado unsaponifiables, eggshell membrane. And so, there's just not a whole lot of data at this point that's really supporting that they do anything beneficial. But, kind of along the lines of what Sailor said is if you feel like it's helping and you've got it in the budget to use it, then most of these aren't going to be detrimental to you. So,
Okay. Melissa says, I couldn't type fast enough to catch the middle one you listed that helps with osteoarthritis. If you don't mind resharing that again.
So there was UC2, which when typed out is UCII, like the Roman numeral 2.
Oh, okay.
Green-lipped mussel and chondroitin sulfate are the ones that actually have a decent amount of study data behind them. As far as other things, there's MSM, glucosamine, ASU, which is an avocado unsaponifiable, eggshell membrane. I mean, there's glucosamine, things like resveratrol too. So there's all kinds of different ingredients, but really there's not a ton of data that shows that they're actually beneficial every time. So, to be considered a treatment, they actually have to be consistent in their use, and they have to show that they're actually demonstrating an improvement. And so the ones that we have seen that with are UC2, green-lipped mussel, and chondroitin sulfate. But a lot of times you're going to have multiple of these things in there because they're not typically going to be detrimental. And then if you do see a result, wonderful. If not, then you might just be spending money for a very expensive top dressing. But that being said, tons of people do feed them and feel like they have results. I've got mine on a glucosamine supplement simply because I'm like, maybe the shellfish in here is helping. Maybe it's just making me feel better. I don't really know. But I started taking a cosamine ASU myself, and it definitely did help my knees for riding. Now I can ride for like 2.5 hours instead of 1 hour before
I was
my
like,
knees
maybe I need
hurt,
to pick your
so.
brain here because I have two very bad knees that are going to need replaced someday.
Right. Yeah. So I used cosamine ASU myself, and I feel like that helped. So yeah. But
Is this right? Joy says, okay, green lip mussel, IC2, and I'm not going to try to pronounce that.
Yep.
Chondroitin.
Yep.
Got it.
Yeah. So, kind of the ones that I tend to look at as far as brands that I trust, that I recommend. And with all supplements, they are not regulated by the FDA. So there's not really much oversight in general. If it's really cheap, there's a reason. But that being said, there is something, and it's much more common for small animal supplements, called the National Animal Supplement Council, so NASC. Anyone that's part of that program, basically the companies sign up for this voluntary program, and so they're agreeing to have randomized audits both at their production places and their storage. So they're making sure that what they say is their production is actually their production. They have to have studies showing that their product actually does make a difference and that it does contain what it has in it, because a lot of places, if you actually go in and test those supplements, they may not have the levels that they claim. They may not even have the ingredients that they claim. And so with the membership to this, that you're at least getting some kind of quality control there. You don't tend to see it quite as much in equine products just because there's so many. But certainly, looking for companies that have been around for 20, 30 years can be very helpful, and that there's a lot of ones that just kind of pop up, sell some stuff, and then disappear. And there's usually a reason for that. But kind of the ones that I tend to recommend as far as over-the-counter joint supplements, if that's something that people are interested in, Equithrive is a good one. Cosequin, which is from Nutramax. That's the equine version of the human one that I take. For the UK people, UMove is wonderful. I really like that joint supplement. It's got green-lipped mussel in it, but unfortunately, in the last year, they stopped distributing it to the US because cost was too much. So sad for us, but the UK peeps can still get it. And then Platinum CJ is your joint one. The other one that I found that still contained green-lipped mussel was Gold Label GLM, but their levels are a little bit kind of all over the place. So they're a little bit on more of the subtherapeutic side. So it's difficult to find one that checks all the boxes. And there's always things too, like Smart Pack and places like that are generally going to be trustworthy. You're just maybe not going to see as much of the benefit from any of the real oral joint supplements, just because they're so variable as far as absorption.
Mm-hmm. Which makes sense because I think about me like taking supplements or even taking like my Synthroid and how careful you have to be about when you eat and what you have right before and what you have right after just because of absorption. You think
Right.
about your horse's gut and it's like, to me, more chaotic.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And that being said too, with human medications, a lot of times we do see really different absorption in animals. Something like Zyrtec, for example. I have to take that so I can still breathe through my nose, but it's only about 10 to 15% bioavailable in like dogs and cats. So,
Wow.
you give it to them and there's only like a 15% chance they're even going to absorb it in the first place.
Wow.
So but that's something that you could go into any grocery store and pick up and be hopefully somewhat effective for a human.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, it's just so different.
variability. Yeah, kind of my joint here. So the point of getting trade competition.
Hang on, rewind, repeat that sentence.
Oh, I kind of got joint supplement now, so now I'm ready to get on the trailer to go to the competition now.
Yes.
Okay.
All
Yes.
right. We'll take
All
it.
right.
We've made it there,
So,
guys. We've arrived.
right.
3 weeks, but we did it.
Excellent. So I kind of broke this down into categories as far as kind of I called it injury prevention for travel. So as far as kind of the first category is limbs. So you're putting your horse on a metal box and shaking it down the highway for anywhere from kind of 3 to 12 hours, depending on where you're coming from. So I think wrapping legs is really important for trailer rides. It gives them some extra support, but also if you have to, hit your brakes harder than expected, there's a pothole, you want to make sure that they're protected from themselves. Most of the trailers are going to have your rubber mats, and you want to make sure that they're in place. If you see any rivets sticking out or anything sharp, pointy, pokey, you can pretty much be guaranteed that your horse will find that object and it will step on it and it will cut itself.
Yep.
So, making sure that all of those things are addressed is going to be important. But driving carefully as well. They are basically like us riding a bus for a long time. It's a lot of work. It's not easy. And so I have unfortunately been through trailer accidents where, if you do get hit by someone, that metal is very sharp. It will act like a piano, and it can definitely cut them. You're much more likely to have protection to those structures, like those tendons, those ligaments in the lower leg, if you wrapped. And I tend to prefer wraps over things like shipping boots, just because you do get that extra added support. But shipping boots definitely can be helpful, especially if you don't feel confident in your wrapping skills. If you don't feel super confident in your wrapping skills, the Pony Club manuals are amazing as far as all the different types of leg wraps, things like that, whether you're doing shipping, standing, something that has to go above the knee, a figure eight, polos, they've got all of those on there. There's a million YouTube videos on how to wrap a leg too, if you prefer something a little bit more visual than reading, and then just practice.
Yeah.
The first time I put a leg wrap on, it looked terrible. After having Tootsie, who at the end of her life had four legs that were wrapped every day for the last 3 years, I'm really good at leg wraps, and so
It's so important to practice.
The more you practice, the better you get at it, much like most things in life. So that would kind of be what I've got on limbs is just trying to make sure that you drive carefully and wrap. And I am a little bit cautious using things like liniment and stuff like that under a wrap, because sometimes you can scald their legs with it. So I just tend to use plain wraps, or I really like the uptight poultice. If you're worried about them, it's a plain clay poultice. There's no extra added things to it. So that tends to be kind of nice. It'll help draw the heat out of their legs, but they're really unlikely to have a reaction to it because it's just kind of a plain clay.
Yeah.
Any questions on limbs?
No,
Okay.
I think, guys, if you haven't, I can't stress this enough. There are so many people I meet nowadays that I feel could benefit from learning to put good polar wraps on, do a hawk wrap, do a knee wrap, get a good shipping wrap or a standing wrap. Like having that in your arsenal if something goes wrong with your horse is so important. So that you're prepared to do it versus learning the second things go wrong.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So, so I guess moving on to kind of the next category of let's try not to get our horse injured on the way there is lungs. And so, the trailer is not an ideal situation for their respiratory tract. A lot of times their head is tied in an upright position. Depending on how often you clean yours out, it could be dusty, it could be musty, there could be strong odors. So the cleaner you can have your trailer, the better. Ideally, we really want to minimize the dust in there because if you've got tons of shavings in there, a lot of times those shavings are really dusty. So ideally, trying to wet those down as much as you can be really helpful. So that way, as they're kind of around in there, you're not getting a ton of dust stirred out. Because if you think about dumping a bag of shavings in an enclosed area,
Yeah,
it's really dusty. And, that's not great for their respiratory tracts, just like it's great for ours to stand in there and deal with that. Other thing too would be the hay. A lot of times, even if you have good quality hay, it's still going to be a little dusty. If they will eat soaked hay, soaking their hay or dunking their hay net in a bucket to kind of wet it down before a ride is going to be very helpful. The chopped hays that come in the bags, oftentimes those have been put through blowers, so they're going to be way less dusty. But certainly that is a concern. And they actually found in some studies that having horses free in something like a stock trailer, like in a stock stall, allowed them to put their head down to choose their orientation. And so that way too, they have a little chance to kind of move their head and their neck around a little bit more, because when they hold their head up, they do get some fluid that pools kind of right there at the junction where the neck meets the chest. And it's normal to have a little bit of fluid there, but the longer they sit with that upright, the more likely they are to have respiratory issues. So even just, opening the windows and allowing them to kind of stretch their head down and move it around during those trailer rides can be helpful on that aspect as well. And sometimes it's just not practical, but at least trying to minimize the dust and maximize the airflow is going to be helpful too, especially in the summertime when it's really stinking hot down south. And so trying to travel in the earlier parts of the day before the sun is at its worst, having, windows open if it's safe to do so. And I never recommend having a completely open window because horses can and will try to jump out those. But if you've got bars on the windows, trying to have those open or opening as much as you can. Val actually had a really awesome hack. If you guys have seen her trailer hack where she had the little PVC pipes on the outside to bring airflow in. But anything you can do to try to cool off the trailer, because horses are hot. And when you pack several of them into an enclosed space, they really do.
It gets toasty in there, and people don't realize it, I think, until
So
you've
fast.
jumped in the back with your horse and gone somewhere.
It's like an oven.
Yeah.
And they do make little trailers, things like that too, that can help circulate the air when you're maybe are not moving, like if traffic stopped, things like that. But planning your travel around, trying to not have it be in the hottest part of the day is going to be helpful. And sometimes you just can't help it, but ideally trying to move at cooler times of the day is going to be more helpful for them. Any questions on airflow?
No, and I had never thought about wetting shavings before putting it in a trailer, so.
Yeah, I haven't really thought of that
Absolutely.
either. Did you mention this already? I don't know if I'd missed it. You were talking about buying other things and I was Googling it, about wetting like hay during travel. Did you mention that?
Yeah, so you
Okay.
can take your hay net and dunk it into a water trough, and that's a quick and dirty way of kind of soaking it. If you use bagged hay, that's already kind of dust free, so you might just cheat and use that. You don't want to just suddenly feed them something that they're not used to, but certainly kind of wetting down the hay if they'll eat it wet. If they don't, try to get it out, shake it around a bit, try to shake as much dust out as you can.
Yeah.
Having something more like an open hay net is going to be more beneficial as well, because like the bags with the little holes and then they just stuff their face right in the hole, and then they're breathing a lot more dust.
Ventilator.
Right. That being said, some of the more open hay nets, like the actual nets. If they climb your trailer, like some of mine do, they'll stick their feet in it and get stuck in it. So there's pros and cons to both of, will your horse kill itself if it climbs into your hay net and gets a leg stuck? I've had to do that before, where you have to climb into the trailer with a pair of scissors and cut them out of a hay net. Summer does not appreciate being stuck in traffic, and so she will climb up my wheel well and paw and then stick her leg in the hay net, and then I'll have to go rescue her. So now she has a bag, so sorry about her breathing, but it's an improvement on breaking her leg, so that's where we are. But she's at least very good at letting you rescue her. Like, she'll just stand there with her leg like, can you come get me? So yeah, she just.
I feel like we only, so just noting Greg's comment that he said we don't put shavings in our trailers, just rubber mats. I feel like we don't put shavings in our trailers for short rides, but we tend to for long rides, because I've had horses that urinate and get really messy
slippery
and really slip. Yeah.
So ideally, if you talk to like internal medicine, respiratory people, they recommend not putting shavings or anything in the trailer, but practically I find those rubber mats are quite slippery when wet. So alternately, you could only kind of put shavings back in the areas where they would urinate and defecate, so trying to kind of minimize them. I have actually started moving to the pelleted shavings, so like the pelleted bedding, and just soaking those down really well, so that way they're damp and they're less likely to blow around. So I found that's less dusty. And then just making sure you clear out any urine soaked bedding, old hay, like dusty old hay that's been sitting in your hay net for like 2 weeks since the last competition. Get that out of there. So it's gross. Nobody wants to eat it anyway, and then it just is a nice place for mold to grow. So but yeah, really trying to kind of minimize the amount of dust and maximize the airflow is our goal. And then if you're going on really long trips, ideally you want to try to have them have a break where they can get off, put their head down, move their legs around, get water. And I know Sailor kind of addressed some of those things too in her discussions about, the weight loss and things like that, but it is really important.
Yeah, I think, and so when you say a longer trip, what do you think of, because I think some of our competitors are traveling 8 to 12 hours.
Yeah. So ideally, if you're going more than about 3 hours or so, I would try to stop, offer them water. A lot of times they may or may not drink it. Most of them usually won't, but at least kind of give them a chance to have a little rest from driving, whether it's just a little, rest break so they're not constantly bouncing and having to shift their weight and moving, but at least, offering them water, making sure they're okay. And, if you're looking at, 8 and 12 hours, I would really try to plan to have somewhere where you can unload them, let them walk around for a little bit, have a little fresh grass, try to, really see if you can convince them to drink some water. Certainly if you're going more than 12 hours, I would even think about trying to plan a layover in there.
Yeah.
So
we're going on 9:15 p.m. And so
right.
I would
be a good place to stop.
Suggest that this is a good place for us to stop. And then next week we parlay into a little conditioning discussion and a little first aid.
Excellent. So yeah, for next week, what I've got is how to take care of the GI tract. So ulcers,
so good,
colic,
considering my new horse,
diarrhea, all of those things, as well as then kind of going into the first aid kit. So really the GI tract is probably where most of our issues are going to come from as far as travel and or just being at the competition. So I've definitely got tons that I can talk about then as far as the GI tract and
I am so there for
trying to help keep it healthy. But at least now we've made it onto the trailer. So hopefully.
So we did so good tonight, guys.
Oh, right.
Oh my gosh. And you guys, thank you so much for all the comments and for the interaction. It really does help steer the conversation and make sure that we're addressing things that are relevant to your concerns with your horses, right? So bring them back next week. GI tract, ulcers, first aid. I think we'll cover everything right before we go into our competition season here. And really quickly, I will go over a couple of the upcoming events because we've got Fred's first competition coming up in Pennsylvania
Oh,
That's on April 13th. And so I think that's completely like booked out, which is super exciting. But the 13th, technically, if you guys are going, that's like the start of your competition season. So just before that, we can wrap all of this up with first aid GI track. And then on the 21st, we've got our little Sun and Fun pairs in Hillsborough, Virginia, which is going to be a blast. I know that Caroline's going to be there if you want to get a fan signature or something.
Or, any local people, it's not too far of a drive. It's still in the state. So,
Yeah.
come try it out.
Hitch a ride and come try it out, and we'll find a pony to loan. And then we've got April pairs in Upper Marlboro, Maryland, that Sharon and Matt are going to be hosting. That's April 27th, 28th. That rolls out into the Southern Series 1, which is May 11th and 12th. And then we go into our broader MA series here. So the whole season is starting to heat up, which is really exciting.
we got
And
like
I
2
can't
weeks now.
wait.
So
I
excited.
know. I can't wait to pivot and start talking about some more games prep and what people are doing for the season. But first, let's talk care. So I'm excited about that because this is very
If it
relevant to
would
me right now.
stop raining, I'd actually get on the pony.
I know it's been
Yeah.
really rough. I've been doing a lot of groundwork, but yeah, it's getting on. It's hard when you don't have an indoor.
Yeah.
Oh, the people that do.
Right. Must be nice.
Oh
Some
my
of us
gosh.
are just out here in the mud. I feel like it's extra conditioning if you're having to slop through the mud because it's harder to walk.
It's kind of like those pools where they like put them in the, or like the people in
Mhm.
Ireland who are just riding the
Aerobic.
coast and they put their horse through the ocean. Like that's how I
Right.
feel in Virginia right now.
Oh,
Caroline, thank you so much for joining us. You guys, thank you
You are
so much for
welcome.
watching. We will see you again next week on Wednesday
All
Night Live
right.
here at 8:15 p.m.
bye.
Bye,
Bye.
guys.